Thanks for permission. Cool. Lovely. Well, it's nice to see you all again on Monday. Thanks for coming along. It's yeah, it's not nothing to put aside such a chunk of your day, but it's great to see you all. So today, yeah, it's a really good. I love this topic and subject. I wish I could convince someone to let me teach a course on it, just because it's so fun and fascinating. I think it's one of the most important things we do as scientists, as humans working with information. I think one of the most important things we can do is spend some effort on learning how to visualize our data properly and thinking hard about this stuff. And that's what we'll do today. We'll mess around with a bit, just go over a few rules of thumb that I like to teach my students when in terms of creating effective visualizations. Just a couple of simple things to keep in mind, some basic principles, and then we'll mess around, continuing our tidyverse adventure. We'll learn a little bit about ggplot2. We'll just do a fairly bare bones introduction, and we'll get the basics going in terms of some of the main graphics that we might like to create, how the little language of ggplot works, how the grammar of graphics works, and we'll just get into building them. And you can we can go as deep down the rabbit hole as we like. So it's just an introduction in terms of getting the basics on the page, but then we'll see that with a few fairly simple tweaks, it's not hard to get basically publication quality plots out of this thing. And so I hope to convince you that it's worth it, although it's fiddling and it's almost like learning another language within a language in some ways. It's worth a little bit of effort because it's very flexible and powerful. And yeah, once you can kind of internalize how it works a bit, it's easy to reach for and get some really nice insight into all this lovely information that we spend so much time and effort gathering. So in our little roadmap, here we are this week. We've sort of skipping the modeling, but we've done a bit of tidying, a bit of wrangling, and we'll build on that as well. So in some of these exercises that we go through, we may need to manipulate our data a little bit before it's in the right form, the ggplot. So we'll be drawing on that, but yeah, we're hanging out here this week before next week, learning a bit how to tie it all together into reproducible documents, again, in keeping with our themes of reproducibility. So what I like to start with, I do genuinely think it's really the most important part of any analysis that we do. It's the first thing that I do to get a feel for my data, even if it's my data that I've gone out and collected, but I'm often working with other people's data, as you will too. First thing I do is plot it. I want to see it, how I get an intuitive feel for data. Some people do, but I think by and large, most of us, we're visual creatures, and it's hard for us to get a sense just from summary numbers and means and errors and all that kind of thing to get a feel for the data. So it's always the first thing I do when we're then running models and trying to figure out statistical relationships. I'm constantly plotting there throughout as well. Diagnosing models, trying to figure out if what I'm doing makes any sort of intuitive sense. If these two things map onto each other, my data and my statistics are telling me the kind of same thing. And it's the last thing we do as well, in terms of presenting the results of our work. Again, maximizing the impact and reach and effectiveness and communicating our core message. I think one of the best things we can do is spend a bit of time thinking hard about how we visualize our data. Even more so, again, because we're time poor and we read papers and we read reports and all that sort of stuff, and you can get you want to be able to get everything you can and should be able to get just about everything you need to from a nice, well-constructed set of graphics. I think through papers, reports, any sort of time and place where we might be presenting quantitative information. I think it's really worth essential to and really worth spending some time on our plots. And it's fun. It's kind of it's one of those many areas where art meets science, and so there's real room for creativity here as well, which you often don't appreciate. So the rules of thumb that we'll stick to and that we'll just keep in mind, these are the things, if there's anything we can take home, and I tell my students if there's just a few simple rules, like data viz and data science as a whole. So data visualization is like a field of research and a science unto itself. But if there are a few things we could take home, it's these, I think, are the big ones. One is that we want to hew as closely to the raw data as possible. So we want to show that data in its rawest form possible, rather than reaching for visualizations that perhaps obscure and summarize and compress a lot of information down into simpler forms. We want to keep things keep as close to the raw data as possible so we can get a feel for what's going on. We want to keep it simple. What journalists, I think, it sort of called maximizing the data to ink ratio. So you just want it as absolutely simple as possible. That conveys the message that you want to convey. So you need to think hard about the message, the bare minimum that you would need to convey that, and go no further than that, essentially. And the related point is that everything should be intentional. So with all these packages and plots and things that we use, especially, there are lots of defaults and things. We'll create a little graphic and it'll throw up its own thoughts as to what an axis label should be or a background should be or whatever. And so I just reiterate that we should, once you've got something going, go through every single element of your plot, every label, every word, every tick location, every title, every bit of color, every shape. And every single one should be fulfilling a purpose. It should be intentional. You should want it to be there for a particular reason. And if it's not pulling its weight, then you get rid of it. And so that's just a process of refinement as well as we build these things along the road. And so it's traditional in these chats about data viz to go through, some awful examples and sort of learn from what not to do. And so there are a few problems that we often hit when it comes to data visualization. And I think the three big ones that are nicely summarized as aesthetics, substance, and perception, I think, are three big categories of issue that we often hit when building graphics or encountering them out in the wild. Aesthetics, by aesthetics, I mean just like bad taste, just ugly colors or nasty whatever choices around just visualization there, so aesthetics. Substance is problems with the data itself, or how it's actually being put together. So really more substantive, in terms of the data itself, there might be issues. And perception, which is a separate, kind of related to aesthetics, but it's more about misleading or perhaps unintentionally deceptive elements of your visualization that arise from the way in which people perceive visual information. And so you can play tricks on people just because of the way that we naturally, intuitively, process visual information. It can give rise to problems of perceptive problems. And this one here, if you can, maybe take a moment to tally up some issues. This kind of contains all of them. And we can tally up a few against each of these. So I reckon it's a really simple bit of information, I suppose. So if we pull out the key message, we've got life expectancies here across 5 continents. But it's just a bit of a woeful mess. So there's, in terms of aesthetics, maybe I'd say things like colors are just, they're bad colors anyway, they're ugly, they won't be colorblind friendly, they're unnecessary, they're duplicating information. So you can see that we've got 5 different colors, we've got a legend for each of those colors, but on the axis label here, you've already got the category labels there. So the colors add nothing, apart from maybe they're an attempt to zhuzh it up a bit, but even there, they don't do so very well. They're quite ugly. If we go even deeper and just down the rabbit hole of colors here, it's actually a continuous color scale, but they're categorical data. So that can be a perceptive issue as well, because going through the spectrum here from sort of reds to yellows to greens to blues, that's a continuous color palette. And so maybe it gives us some feeling that there is some continuous relationship between our variables here, but they're just raw categories. You could plot these 5 continents in any order. So that's a perceptual issue. Continuing on the perceptual issues, you've got this awful 3D oblique perspective. And so what this plot is trying to give us is 5 numbers, right? The mean life expectancy, well, presumably it's the mean. We don't actually know, it doesn't say. But we can't even read those off reliably because of this 3D oblique perspective with shadows thrown on the background for extra noise. So I really have no idea what Africa, I couldn't read off the number that they're trying to present here for Africa, say. Is it something like this? Do I have to imagine that the line continues here and lands around 50 somewhere, but then the shadow is thrown and it reaches up to sort of 89, 90. So I have no idea really what that number is. It could land anywhere in there. And that's a perceptual issue that they've created. And there are many more substantively things like, I don't know if these are means or medians or whatever. There should be area here, so they haven't sampled presumably every member of all these continents. So there should be some kind of sense of error because means without that. And you know, then we can just go through our 3 rules as well. There's so much stuff here that's just not serving the core message of the graph, and then actually obscures its intended purpose, which is very, very simple. So it breaks all our rules, and it highlights all our little aesthetic problems that we've run into. And there's a few more. So I've got some in your books there. We can go through and just have a quick chat. I'd be happy to hear anyone's thoughts if they think. Some of them, we've got sort of 3 to run through. Maybe, you know, so roughly with reference to our problems here, we can think about why these do or don't work for their particular use case. It can be handy trying to think about what you think it's trying to achieve in the first place, and then sort of how it's going about it. But we can also just dive into, I don't know, what is specifically wrong, I guess, and in this instance, it's a little bit, it's kind of tried in that it's clearly like some kind of advertising material. So it can be a little bit mean to come at it with a scientific eye, but it's still really breaking all our rules here. Is there anything people do or don't like about this?
I personally don't like the more than 100%.
That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, it's a pie charts, you know, aren't great in the best of cases anyway, but in principle, they're meant to be fractional representations, right? So they should add to 100. So you've got 120% plus 60 degrees, which whatever that means. So you've got the mixing of units as well. I don't even know how that could possibly work. So it's 120% plus 60 degrees Celsius hotness. Look, I mean, it's everywhere. This one's a bit of an easy one. I'm not even sure what they're trying to do. It's obviously just a bit of silly marketing material, but it's also ugly. The colored palette is, you know, aesthetically, that's kind of a matter of preference and choice, but it's a pretty nasty palette. But yeah, substantively, there are big issues here, and things like it's a fractional representation that doesn't add up to it, and then mixing units that shouldn't be displayed on the same graphic at the same time.
Tom, can I ask, did you make this one up, or did you actually?
No, this is real. Sorry,
It's real.
It is. These are all real. So these are ones I encounter in the wild, and I've got a folder full of them because I love keeping them.
Yeah.
I'd have to track down. It might be in the book, but I'm sure I've kept the sources for some of these. But yeah, no, it's real somewhere. I could probably reverse image search it. So all of these, we've got 3 to just have a think about, but these are all real. This was published in the newspaper, this one. So this is a nice one to think about what they're trying to say, and what's actually being said, and whether and how they're going about it. So there's some substantive issues here, I think, and some aesthetic ones, choices as well. What it is an attempt to, so these are gun deaths, I believe, as a function of, so these are gun deaths on our x-axis, on our y-axis, sorry, as a function of time. So there's kind of an unlabeled time axis here. And it's trying to make some point, you know, looking at gun death with reference to these stand your ground laws that were enacted in Florida, whereby you're allowed to use lethal force to defend yourself and your property or something. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not doing it super justice, but essentially you're allowed to use lethal force to protect yourself under a wider range of circumstances. And so it was looking at shifts in gun deaths as a result of that. But it's an interesting one. Anyone like or dislike anything in particular about this?
Why is the y-axis starts with 800 and ends with 400?
Yeah, that's a good one, and it can I don't know how quickly you spotted it, but intuitively we rightly expect y-axes to increase as they go up. So that's certainly a big one. So if we're trying to map the truth of what it's actually showing, and perhaps get a sense of its intended message, I think that's a big one here. So what you actually see, yeah, that's right. It's so unintuitive to read a y-axis like this. So over time, we've actually got a steady decrease in gun deaths, decrease represented by this line pointing upward. And then, you know, this law was enacted, right? And then it's an increase in gun deaths. It's, you know, but purely correlative sort of thing, but you very much get the sense, and then you've got this lovely blood red background here, because this is in a newspaper, of course. So it's hard not to think that what they were trying to show you at a glance, or perhaps someone, you know, wanted you to think at a glance, is that, oh, look, here are these gun laws, and oh, look at this precipitous decline in gun deaths. And that's through via this completely counterintuitive flipping of the y-axis, these aesthetic choices, white and red. Sorry, I interrupted someone.
No, that's okay. I was just going to add to the criticism of the graph.
Yeah, no, please, yeah.
Two things that immediately spring to mind for me were the pet peeve of no axis labels. Like whenever there's no axis labels, it drives me around the bend. And then why they have their first and last points labeled. Like,
yeah, those are true as well. I don't know. Yeah, those are you're right there, and I agree on both counts. Sometimes you can take people, I guess, in a newspaper magazine context, they take some liberties, but you're right that there's no, the lack of axes here is deeply uninformative, and I couldn't say as to why they bothered.
Probably if they are trying to make it look like they decreased the deaths, it goes from 873 to suddenly it's decreased to 721, but then they don't really take into account the middle part there.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, that number is lower than that number. So again, you're right. Even just in that, at a glance, I'm looking, there's a line going down, there's a smaller number here, a big number there. Yeah, that's a good point. It could just be part of the picture that, oh, look, it all went down after this. But in reality, you've got this absurd, that's a good intuition. So that's breaking all our rules, and it's substantive problems there, and intentionally deceptive substantive problems, which is something that we need to be cautious of. People actually, trying to deceive through graphics, which is very easy to do by exploiting those perceptual tricks. And then this one I like just because it's pure chaos on my part, and I've presented this a couple of times now, but it always takes me about 5 minutes to figure out. I've blocked out the headline. And people just spend a little time, like if you had to summarize what this is actually trying to say, punchy, the take-home message. So it's something about mask usage, something about, there's some demographic information in there, but if you're just sort of glancing at this thing, trying to figure out what on earth it's trying to tell us. And I need to revisit it myself because it's just an exercise in pure confusion for me. And so it's mostly issues of aesthetics, and perception.
it looks like a barcode.
It does look like a barcode, it's a completely weird way to present these data. Once we figure out what it actually is, it's quite unintuitive. It's split into 3.
Yeah, is it supposed to be like each line is a mean of that of a different countries? And then the average of all countries, and then the 3 bars is the different age groups, I think.
Wait, average of all countries. Okay, so it's and then I don't know why Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are labeled, but they always are. That's interesting. So
it's very confusing.
It is. So if you were to guess, I've given it to you in the slides, I think, but if you were to guess the headline, say what's the point they're trying to make? What's the, okay, yeah, you're right. So it's age-based demo. So it's split into 3 for some reason for our 3 age groups. And you've got 3 lines that are barely distinguishable, both by thickness and then by color. So maybe color is the way to do it. So these must be the 18 to 24s. And then the 25 to 64. And those are very different width demographic bands as well, which adds to the confusion. 18 to 24 versus 25 to 64 is huge. So each line is a country. I have no idea what those countries are, except for Sweden, Denmark, and Norway for some reason, and only then in these 2 age groups. Got an average without any sort of error. All right, and it's percentage. Okay, so it's mask usage. Yeah, I got you. And then to guess the take-home message, I don't know, it could be something about Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Could be something about
Scandinavian countries don't wear masks very often.
That's right. They are down the bottom in all age categories, which, that looks pointed to me. But anyway, look, if we jump to the next
I would never look at this long enough to be able to. Right. I would just be like, oh, whatever,
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Sort that one out.
It completely fails, which is a part of the point of graphics, is to compress dense, complex information into something readily digestible as well. I think what they were trying to make, the point is about the age-based thing. So young adults have been more open to wearing face masks. That is about the most convoluted possible way I think you could have presented that message with these data. But yeah, so it looks like they're interested in the fact that this yellow dot is a tiny bit higher than, so it's barely even higher than, so it doesn't even make that point terribly well, because I have no idea what the area is here, but eyeballing those distributions, like I wouldn't be convinced that that number is even bigger than that number. And this number contains people 25 to 64. That's a huge range. So I don't even think it does that very well, but I suppose these two are bigger than this. Anyway, it's awful. It breaks all our rules. There are substantive issues. There are perceptual and aesthetic ones. It's a very weird way to present these data, and it just failed. You, like you say, it's on a, you're on a phone. You'd scroll straight past that because I have no idea what that's trying to tell me. Yeah, that's a rough one. So that with those in mind and those that chaos to guide us on our correct paths, some new toys that we can play with and learn this week is, which is what we're here to learn, is this ggplot2. So the way this works is we can think of, so what we can think of is true that languages themselves, all languages are comprised of different elements. So we've got nouns and verbs and articles and subjects and whatnot. The way in which those things are combined are what we call the grammar of a given language. And there was this invention, I think it was originally in the 70s, the first was proposed, but there's similarly, there's a grammar of graphics. And it works similarly by defining sets of rules for how visualizations should be combined together into layers, into a layered approach. And so this is what ggplot, grammar of graphics plot, I don't know, the GG is grammar of graphics, and it's a visualization language. And what it does is it presents graphics as, it's a statistical graphic is a mapping of data. So data variables to aesthetic attributes of geometric objects. And we'll break that down into a few parts and we'll see that how that is actually implemented. But those are our three key elements here. We have data, we have aesthetic attributes, and we have objects. So geometric objects like lines and points and bars and boxes and that kind of thing. So keeping that in mind, it's quite a literal implementation in that way. The ggplot is quite a literal implementation of this grammar of graphics. And it has our three parts here. So we have data, which is the data set itself, contains all our rich information. Each plot also has a geom, one or more geom, which is our geometric object in question. So points or lines or bars, it's the type of object that we actually want to whack onto our plot. And then there's aesthetic information. So how X and Y are related to one another, the color, the shape, the size, the position, all those aesthetic aspects of our plot. And they're mapped onto our data. Data, geometric objects, and aesthetic attributes mapped onto those variables in our data. So those are the three building blocks of all of our ggplots. All of our ggplots have these three things and they're specified in a particular way. And then there's kind of an infinite number of extra little customizations and aesthetic attributes and all sorts of things we can use beyond that. But those are our core, three key ingredients that we'll keep coming back to and keep building. So I'll walk you through one. We'll step through a bunch of them, but if we just start, like the very, very simplest sort of template of what a ggplot looks like. It would look something like this. And actually, even this is a touch too complex because I can get rid of these customizations. Really, all it needs at the very, very base level is data, some information on how those aesthetics are mapped onto the data. So like, what's my X variable? What's my Y variable? And then a geometric object. So what kind of geometric object do you want to represent those data? Is it a point? Is it lines? Is it bars? So what kind of plot is it, basically? And then we can just customize into infinity to create until our heart's desire. Our hearts are full. So I've got last week in the slides, I went through and tidied up and wrangled this ecological data set. I've just given you the clean version of that. So you can go through those other slides if you ever wanted to actually get to where we did. But the data set that I've given you in the chat there, and yes, sorry, I'll give you some of last week's, I just saw your message there. I'll give you the last couple of weeks workshops as well. Let me just copy and paste that in case anyone popped in. But So the data that I've given you is this. It's like a cleaned data set. Where's my plots? From our ecological data, let's have a quick look at it actually. And this is what I'll be using. This is what these slides will be using today. And we'll be using in our exercises as well. We'll just open it up in Excel very quickly. So these are our, it's that ecological data set where you've got some weight and hindfoot length measurements of various different animals across different taxa and genera. There's like a record, there's day, month, year. We've got the ID of a particular plot, an ID for each species, sex of each observation there. And yeah, so the hindfoot length and weight are our two quantitative outcomes. And then some other descriptive information as to what kind of animal that measurement came from. It's got a big data set. There's like 30,000 observations in there. So this is the nice, clean, tidy version. We already did some things like removed NAs and put it into a nice format and whatnot last week. But I'll get rid of you. And that's what I'll just be using to build many of these plots in our little exercises as well. So if we start with that, and here's what I mean by it's kind of in the same way, it is tricky and unintuitive at first, but ultimately building these ggplots, kind of like how I think our pipes tap into the way in which we like to think about problems as one thing leading into another, is building things incrementally. In some ways, ggplot works the same because we really build up layers of these plots step by step. Base graphics can be a little bit more convoluted and complex, but by sort of standardizing the language and the way of thinking about graphics in this way, it can ultimately, once we internalize it a bit, be a more intuitive way of attacking these things. So we just start, and if I just ran ggplot, so I need, remember my data, my aesthetics, which tell me how things map onto those data, and then a geom, a geometric object, so like a point or a line. So if I just start with my data and call ggplot, here's my data, then it gives me this, because I've just told it one of the three important things that I need. So it knows what my data are, doesn't know what anything else is, so you just get this big gray blob. But nonetheless, it knows what my data are, so that's good. It's a good start. I haven't told it anything about how to use those data yet, so I've just told it what they are. If I then extend it and add some aesthetic information, so how things should map onto my data, or what I can tell it here is that what on my x-axis here, my x variable is this variable in my data set called weight. And on my y, I want you to put these hind feet lengths, because I'm looking to visualize how weight and hind feet length covaries. So that's my simplest aesthetic mapping here. It's my x variable, and that's my y variable. And so it builds up, and then I've plunked that in there, and now it knows, okay, well, there's an x and a y. It knows that they're both quantitative continuous variables, right? They're continuous measurements, one of weight, one of hind feet length. And so it starts to build up a plot, and it's taken some sensible guesses at things like axis limits and whatnot from the data in there. So starting to build a bit of a graph here. But then I actually need something. Because I'd tell it how I want you to represent these data. Should it be a box plot? Should it be a bar plot? So I need to specify that graphical representation of our data. And by specifying a geom, a geometric object. And in this instance, I want a scatter plot. And so to get a scatter plot, I want to add points to my graph. And so I want geom point is the way in which this language specifies particular geometric objects. It starts with geom, there's an underscore, and then there's a whole bunch of things that could come after that underscore, depending on the kind of geometric object we're looking to add to our plot. For a scatter plot, I want to add points, so I add geom point. And building up, you'll see this little, we'll revisit this a few times, with building up our ggplot, adding layers to our plot. We use this plus sign. And this came, I think this was a decision made long ago, and sort of came before it functions kind of sort of similarly to pipes in a way, because we're just incrementally adding layers, but the end of a line should always have a plus symbol if you're looking to add an extra layer to our plot. So you'll see a lot of these kicking around as we continue to build and customize and create. So we've got our basic information here. Here's my data, here's my aesthetics. And finally, my third key ingredient is my geometric mapping here, and I want a point. So I want you to add some points to my little graphic. And then, those are the absolute bare minimum of what we need. And so it's done the hard work for us, and whacked together, we have a fully functional scatter plot here. It's not great, but it does the trick anyway. It's at least got the raw ingredients there for what we need. So those are our 3 key ingredients and how they've played together to create our little plot. And then just to jump forward, and we'll learn some tricks as we go here, but some fairly simple ingredients that we might do to class this up a bit. So if I was to eyeball this plot and think about our 3 take-home messages, keep it simple, stick to the raw data. I think we're doing that pretty well because those are just the raw data. They're our X, Ys. That makes sense. Each one of those is a single observation. Keep it intentional. Everything should be, keep it as simple as possible to convey our message, and everything should be intentional. So some things that bug me would be like this background, which is kind of noisy and a bit ugly. I don't think it's doing a lot of work there. Our X and Y variables, the labels maybe aren't as good as they could be. This one still has underscores in it because of our tidy principles, right? So we might want to make something a bit more human readable. The access limits look okay. Maybe we could tweak this a little bit, but those would probably be the big ones. Get rid of that background, tidy up the labels. And so a couple of tricks we can do. Once we remember them, I can just fix up, you can use this X lab and Y lab. We can, again, and you can see how we're forever just adding layers to our plot using these plus symbols. So there are some arguments here like X label, Y label, X lab, Y lab. And I can just punch in my nice tidy label, which gives us this. So that's much nicer, in my opinion. I can add units to these labels, which is something we want to do for sure. And then I've jumped ahead, and we'll come back to this for sure, is that there are also these lovely pre-built themes in ggplot. And so a theme is like a whole set of visual and aesthetic tweaks to the plot. There are dozens of them. People have made their own. So there are actually many, many of them, but there are a handful built in that we might draw on. And it's essentially a sensible set of defaults. So there are a couple of themes that I often just reach for. Theme classic is one of them. And just by specifying theme classic, it's actually, so the only thing I've manually changed on this plot, for example, is the axis labels here. And I've also added a bit of transparency to these points. We'll talk about that in a second as well. All this other stuff, so getting rid of the background and the ugliness and the type of point and all these lines and whatnot, it's just because I've picked a fairly simple theme here that has some nice clean basics. And I've said, actually just use that set of attributes for us. And so that's done a lot of the extra hard work for us. And through those 2 simple tweaks, or 3 little lines of code, you've got a graphic there that I would happily see in, if you had to pop that into a paper or something, or in a report of some kind, with relatively little effort there. That's a very clean and simple visualization that's gone a long way, and will certainly outshine your Excel defaults or whatnot. But we can, of course, it says into infinity, there are really, we can build whatever your imagined desires, but I guess part of the benefit of ggplot is that, yeah, with a handful of tricks that you just kind of learn and keep reaching for, you can go a long way into creating some pretty clean and simple visualizations that they're also very flexible for different kinds of data set as well. So there's a few tricks we learned in there, and I'll stop at a couple of points and reiterate them. So plots are built iteratively. So we build them up in layers. And our 3 key core ingredients are data, aesthetics. So like what's your X, what's your Y, and how do these things map onto our data? And geometric objects. So what do you actually want represented and put on our plot? Lines, points, boxes, bars, whatever. We add and we build using this plus symbol. That's always at the end of a line. So you can see plus, 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 plus right up to the end here. And that's the finish of our plot. So there's no more pluses. So we use the little plus symbol at the end of our line. You can actually assign these to objects as well. So you can save these plots. I'm like, yeah, it's trickier with base graphics, but so you can just save this as an object, hindfoot plot, use as you would anything. So you just assign that entire plot to an object, and then you can always call it later on and it'll just rebuild the whole thing for you. And this is just something to flag that we can go into in a little more detail later, but these aesthetics, so like this X and Y here, by specifying them up top here in this first call to ggplot, they are global aesthetics. So everything we subsequently do really applies is mapped on to this exact relationship here. So every color tweak we make, every tweak to the transparency of points, it's mapped exactly onto those. Sometimes there are cases where we might just want local aesthetics. So if we have, often it arises when you're combining multiple geometric objects. So you might have a box plot with points lying on the top of it, which we'll get to actually. And you might want to just tweak the transparency of the points or the color of the points, for example. And so you can make those localized tweaks. Sometimes you need to specify local aesthetics. So you might see this AES aesthetic also appearing down here in some of our geometric objects. That's a slightly more down the line thing that we can get to. By and large, everything that we do will just apply globally to our aesthetic mapping up the top here. But it's just a flag that we may also reuse it. If you want finer control or slightly different manipulations, finer manipulations down the line, there are ways in which we can do that. Those are a handful of tricks that we've just whipped through pretty quickly, I think. Oh yeah, so we'll start, oops, hold on. We'll start diving in shortly. But basically what we'll, we can spend the next while doing is just moving through some of the big graphics that we might encounter and that we do often encounter in our day-to-day lives. So we've got scatter plots, line graphs, box plots, histograms, and bar plots, I think are probably the big ones that we encounter as Evo type people. There are lots of other graphics, more specialized things that you might come across if you're a genetics person or in medicine or whatever, but these are pretty big common day-to-day ones that we come across, and they're handy for a reason. We don't need to worry about that so much. I tend to just I like to ask students, test their understanding of what these things roughly look like, and where you might use two continuous variables versus one discrete and one continuous versus numerical and categorical data. And we just map those on to refresh our understanding here. But we can crack on and just say, so these are our 5 types of plot, which represent basically 5 kinds of geometric object or relationship. So here's ones that if you just remember a handful and otherwise Google endlessly. I'm constantly Googling when I'm using R full stop, but certainly when I'm using ggplot2. So by all means, Google is your friend, but I can generally remember a few of these anyway. I've also thrown in a cheat sheet into our little downloaded thing, so it's got these sort of listed out. Here are the 5 that we can play with today and get a bit familiar with. Scatter plots. Scatter plots are 2 continuous numerical variables represented by points. So that's G on point. Line graphs, you can see we've got G on line. The theme is continuing here. Box plots, G on box plot. Makes sense, easy enough to remember. Same for histograms. There are a couple of ways to make bar plots depending on what how the data is structured, which we can have a look at. But those are the big ones, I think. And we can also combine and mix and match, which we'll get to as well, which is fun. And so we can just, spend some time working through each of these and getting a bit of a feel for it and building up a little repertoire of ways in which we can build our ggplots. Sorry, my job. So our scatter plots are for, as I said, 2 numerical relationships, visualizing the relationship between these things. G on point is what we want, because they are the geometric object that we are plonking onto our plots is a point. So let's, we've got some built-in data here that we can use just to illustrate how these things are actually built. So there's a built-in data set on it's a New York City flights. And so we can visualize the relationship between delays in departure times and delays in arrival times in the US in flights from New York City, I think it is. So we're just building up the simplest possible plot that we've got. We can see that I've said, all right, here's my data. It's called Alaska flights. And I think you've got access to that as well. You should be able to reproduce all of these. Here is my aesthetic mapping. So my X variable is departure delays. My Y variable is arrival delays. So I want to see how these things two relate to each other, get a bit of a feel for the data. And it's a scatter plot. So I just want you to represent these geometrically as points on my plot. And so I tend to ask at this point, you know, what's this actually telling us? We've got a bit of a feel for the data. Yeah, unsurprisingly, what kind of a relationship do we tend to see? Pretty well, I could draw a kind of a straight line again. And I also like to make the point that some of the graphics can so often take the place, or at least, you know, yeah, essentially take the place of them, arguably often more important than any sort of fancy statistics that we can do. Because the best regression that you can kind of run is just, you know, print this out and draw a straight line through it. Looks like there's a pretty straightforward linear relationship there between delays in departing flights and delays in arriving flights. A whole bunch of zeros. So there's a big cluster of zeros, which I suppose makes sense. If you're not delayed on departure, you tend not to be delayed on arrival. Yeah, and so I'd say there's a nice strong linear relationship, and this clustering around zero are probably some of the more interesting features. But there are some aesthetic issues here, so we can do better than this. And as we move through our 5 different plots, we'll learn a couple of new tricks along the way. So one of the key issues, I think, just in terms of an effective visualization, is probably this big chunk, this big cluster of points down here. It's hard. There's a lot of information there's some information anyway being lost down here, because each is represented by a solid black point. Then you kind of get this big black hole down here. And I have no idea how many points are actually down there, or what the kind of density of information is. There could be 1,000 flights hidden in that big black circle. It could be 10 that just happen to overlap perfectly. So there's a bit of information loss going on. Also some ugly sort of aesthetics going on. The background, I think, is a bit noisy. X and Y labels aren't very good. The axes are okay, although I'm not quite sure why that extends down below zero. There's a bit of jittering going on. But we can start with attacking one of these problems. And there are often multiple solutions to these things as we go and as we'll learn. So there's a few different tools in our toolkit that we can use here. So there's a lot of overplotting there at 0, 0. There's a lot of plot points falling on top of one another. A couple of ways in general which you might do that, which you might think about affecting change for this, is one, we can add a bit of transparency to these points. And what I've done there is by, so in the call to my little geometric object here, I've added this argument called alpha. An alpha of 1 is fully opaque, so it's dead black like it was beforehand. An alpha of 0 would be completely transparent and ultimately invisible. And so you can mess with those things. And that's specified within my call to this geometric object because it just applies to that. It's a very specific manipulation of the visual appearance of my geometric object there. So that's where I'm calling this little alpha argument. There are lots of these arguments. The help files detail them, but there are a few you might reach for. So here I've just added transparency. So it's about 20%. So I've knocked off a lot, added a lot of transparency here. And I guess one of the benefits in terms of our overplotting here is it actually adds an extra dimension of information there. Because now we have our individual points, and then there's something of a continuous gradient in blackness in terms of when you have a certain number of points overlaying one another, it'll get darker and darker. So in some ways, it's actually added an extra dimension of information there. I can see that it's not equal. It wasn't exactly a big black oval, actually. There are a couple of some hotspots throughout here. These big black regions are really where there's a lot of overlapping information. And now I've actually separated that out a little bit and begun to explicitly represent it, again, hewing to close to our raw data as possible there. So that's cool, which is the point I'm making. So transparency is cumulative here. So although I've said every individual point should have an alpha value of 0.2, if you put 10 on top of each other, it's still going to be an alpha of 1, right? Because it's cumulative, or 5, sorry. So 5 points on top of each other will make a perfectly black point. I think it's linear. So we've added that extra information by doing so. So that's cool. That's one way of dealing with our overlaying, our overplotting there. There's another way we could do it, which you might come across, and we'll play with in a couple of contexts. We can nudge those points out of the way of one another. We can add a bit of noise to them, and so we can kind of shuffle them around. So instead of saying using the geometric object geom point, we can use this one called GMJitter. And you'll see in your cheat sheets that there are often a couple of alternative versions of our geometric objects that we might be able to slot in on top of each other. This one is, again, it's a kind of point. So our GMJitter is just, we want points as our fundamental object here, but we want you to add a little bit of noise to them. So kind of just shuffle them around so you can kind of run your fingers through them and separate them out a little bit. And in doing so, we get a bit more separation between our points here, and you can control the exact amount of jitterage, of noise that gets added to our plots. So it can be quite jittery, and it can be so jittery to the point where it actually destroys the relationships between our variables, or it can just be a tiny little bit, and it's ultimately just an aesthetic judgment. You tend to fiddle those numbers just to see what kind of works and what doesn't. But this is the end result. So we can, again, we've largely dealt with that overplotting issue. So there's no big black hole here in the center, because we've kind of said, we'll just add a bit of noise randomly to our X and Y and kind of run your fingers through that and separate them out of it. And so there's a couple of tricks there, I guess. Whoops. So the two, we can jump back and forth between them a little bit. I don't know what people prefer. And it's one of those things, there's no necessarily right or wrong answer. I would just be tallying up things like costs and benefits to each in terms of our intended purpose, what it is we're trying to achieve. So there's our transparency version, say.
Can I ask something, Tom?
Yeah.
In the original data, do lots of planes leave early?
Yeah, I think that might be it. I think that's what the below zeros are. I think you're right. I was trying to think of the reason for that as well, but I think you're exactly right. Yeah, I think they must be sneaking off a touch early to get below zero here.
Yep.
So it's kind of a non-delay. Yes, which would make sense. It just didn't occur to me initially because I've never known a plane to leave early, but maybe they do.
Not Australian data then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that would be my guess though. That's a good point. I don't know, and in terms of these, it's up to you. I think for me, probably the main cost to something like jittering, and what you have to be careful with is that you are manipulating the data there, in that you're adding noise to the actual data. So if you're just kind of getting a rough feel for your data or whatnot, and relationships in there, can be very handy. But you need to be, you do need to be conscious of the fact that you're actually adding values. They're noisy, random values, but you're actually changing the underlying data here. So we're kind of technically messing with our raw data to get this. Can be fine and justifiable, like I say, and if you just do it subtly, it's all right. But you can, if you went through and actually played with this when you get hands-on, you can see that you can just destroy the whole thing if you add. So width and height, I believe, are the units they expressed are in units that the two variables are actually expressed in. So I think it's probably, I don't know if it's quite adding as much as 30, but if you jack those numbers right up a bit, you'll just have a big canvas full of like random noise scattered around the place. And similarly, if you put them down to 0, it'll just be the original plot. But I think that would probably lean me towards maybe something like the transparency solution. There's lots of other problems here to be dealt with that we can pretty easily, but yeah, I mean, it's just one way of solving the problem. Yeah, do you do?
Another question, Tom. So when we've jittered before, we've always put in the legend that the points are jittered. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, you could. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So that's a good point. Yeah, for sure. So in my figure legend, I would unequivocally, include that the points were jittered by X amount to aid visualization, sort of thing. Or, and some minimum amount of jitter was added to the points just to aid visualization, which you can, but you definitely want to be saying that. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, and I've used it in publications before. Again, it's context dependent. We can do our model fits and whatnot. So maybe as a rule, I might kind of reach for that, but it depends. And if it's a scientific publication versus like a report where you're just trying to make some points or, you know, help people understand basic relationships, that's all the kind of things to take into mind there. But we've learned there's a couple of tricks there. So I think we just split this into 5 bits. So the questions I've got some, what is that, little exercises? It says, oh, there's our cheat sheet as well. So let's not, what are our first? Oh, those are those graphs for you just to mess around with. But so we're calling on those, that clean ecological data, .eco cleaned, which you should have downloadable in those links. And we'll just move through and sort of use some of our little tricks and tips here. So we'll just build a scatter plot first off, answer some, you know, a few questions out loud just for ourselves. And get a bit of a feel at this point for essentially you're just going to rebuild more or less what I just did there, except with our hindfoot weights and lengths. And there's a couple of extra tips and tricks in there as well. Color argument. Yeah, and I will move back just in case. I will leave this on the screen, although you've got the slides as well, just to show you this is what kind of some sort of working basic might look like. And once you've got it, actually, maybe if you like, feel free to slap it in the whatever you come up with in the Google Doc here as well. I think you can just, pretty sure you can just take screenshots and dump them in. So if I take a screenshot of that, and just like drag it into, yeah, okay, whoops, cool. So yeah, maybe if you feel like it, feel free to plunk the results of your efforts in our little shared Google Drive there as well.
Can I ask, Tom, can you, just so that I know that I can reproduce it as well, could you put the Alaskan flight data in there so that we can play with that as well? Because I don't think.
Yeah, let me just double check. I think. It is a built-in, yeah, I'll just get that for you. It's a built-in data set, but we might.
Is it built in? Oh, that's okay.
I think so. But it might actually be in a package. So let me just double check. Anyway. Yeah, I'll leave this here. Yes, it is. It's a built-in package, but I'll copy and paste it around. Oh, whoops. Sorry, so there's everything the flights data here are just part of this NYC flights package. So once you've got that, and I'll stick it in the Google Doc as well, then everything here will just work. Let me plunk this in here with Google Doc as well. No.
Thank you.
No worries. What I've asked us to do. All right, I'll just start chipping away at my own here. Although on that last point, yeah, we'll come to that when we're messing with the color. You actually didn't need to, that can be global. So I'll show you how that works as well. I don't know why I would have said that. I need to revisit some of these notes. All right, so I'm just going to load up my data. That's cool. All right, first up, let's just get a basic one going. Listen, wait, and like, yep. Yeah, okay. It's a very basic what I've got going. It's pretty ugly, but it tells me interesting things about the data, including how they were measured, because these are all in hard lines here. So they're obviously measured to a particular integers. Crazy nonlinear relationship here, it's kind of exponential. All right, so there's a lot of overlay on mine, which is why I think, what do I send? All right, so let's just start fiddling with it aesthetically and get it looking a bit tidier. I'm going to call that my before. All right, I'm going to copy and paste that. Two things I'm going to try and mess with the transparency. What did we try before? We'll start with 5. It's not doing a lot, it's still pretty heavy. It's still quite heavy. Yeah, it's not too bad. That's one option. You could also try and jitter. The defaults. That doesn't help much. Crank up the amount of jitter a bit. Okay. I'm not getting anywhere with jittering these points because there's just too many of them. There's about 30,000 observations here, so I'd say that's a bit of a lost cause. For my money, in which case, let's crack on. So yeah, there are a couple of things we can do. Let's add, just to learn some new tricks. I'm going to stick with my alpha version. All right, so I'm happy roughly with that as my starting point. We can recolor our points if we might want to do that, like so. Add a single color to all of them, although we'd have to reflect on our green, our rules of thumb as to why we're even doing that. But we certainly can add color if we so like. Right. That's not doing it. There we go. Okay. So I can specify things like our color argument in GMPoint here. And I can look at the help file just quickly to see there's a bunch of other arguments that we might include. And here we are. GMPoint understands the following arguments, the following aesthetics, sorry. X and Y, which it needs, and that's what we've already assigned up here. But we can also do things like alpha, color. We can change the color of things. We can change the shape of our points. We can change the size of our points. We can change the fill, so you can have a different colored outline of point versus the fill bit. So these are all common aesthetic tweaks that we might make if we feel that our plot isn't quite up to scratch, and that'll actually applies to a lot of different things. I don't think I'm getting anything extra here from adding color to that, but nonetheless, I now know how to, so that can be handy. Or the final trick I've got here, we can add an extra dimension of information here. For example, if we want to separate these data by, in this case, species. So if you want to break out and represent each of these points on a per species basis, what you can actually do is say, well, I want to add an extra aesthetic attribute to my plot. And I want you to color these things, and I want you to color them according to a particular variable. In this case, species ID. So again, this is like a global, I could actually put this here or in down here, but I think I said to in the instructions to pop it here, but we can do it globally because it applies to the whole thing. So in my call to these aesthetics here, I'm saying, well, here's my X variable, here's my Y variable, and I want you to color those points according to this variable called species ID in my data set. And if it's done that correctly, you should have a kind of a rainbow vomit. There we go. And it'll pick a really ugly palette to begin with. But nonetheless, we've got that extra dimension of information. It also, by default, throws me up a legend here. So aesthetically, perceptually, I don't know if this is a good choice, but it's nonetheless just, you know, it's a tool in our toolkit should we want to do something like that. There's now a few different dimensions of information here, right? X, Y, and XY by species. Further tweaks I would definitely want to be doing if I was to spend some more time on this, choosing a better color palette. This doesn't look terribly, the defaults in ggplot aren't terribly like colorblind friendly. Actually, I'm going to call on one of my magical themes as well. So let's do that. Plus, I often just reach for theme classic. I think is the one I tend to go for. Yeah, you can see what that's done. So it's stripped out that ugly gray background. Bit of transparency there. So you can kind of get per species idea of what's going on here in terms of our length and weight. I'd get rid of the legend for publication. Let me change my X label as well. Call it weight in, must be kilograms. I'm going to mess with my Y as well. I'm going to call that hind foot length. I'd have to double check what that actually is. I think it might be centimeters. Here's my data set. I'm not sure. Insert correct units there. Right now at this point, mess with that transparency a bit as well. We could continue fiddling, but there's a few tricks in play there that I think it's got given us a good rough idea, at least, what these per species relationships are and weight, hind foot length. You know, we can see how I've just iteratively built that up a bit. Those colors aren't great. I would continue fiddling with those eternally. Get rid of that legend. You know, there's lots to be fiddled with there, but that is better than my initial product. So I'm going to call that a win for now anyway. Let's take a screenshot of that. Let's slap that in Google Doc. There we go. Oops. Can we get side by side? I'm going to call this after. Something of an improvement anyway, depending on our goals and intents. And I'll paste my little bit of code. Anyway, a few tricks in play there. Always endless tweaking to be done, but we made some progress and we've got a rough scatter plot going anyway. So a relative of our scatter plot, if we're cracking on a little bit, and we've got, again, numerical variables, but if our independent variable here is ordered, then we might actually like something like a line graph. So it's often temporal time series type data that we plot. Keeping with our theme, it's geom line because it's a line plot, so that one's not too hard to remember as well. And again, the ingredients are the same, the basic tricks are the same, but let's just keep going and building up a little bag of tricks. So sorry, loblolly, this is just a built-in data set. Let me just double check that is indeed the case. L-O-B-O-L-Y. It is, so you could literally run that. It's actually in base R, so you could run that straight off the block. You don't need any to load anything, that just exists in R. It's some kind of plant growth as a function of age. Yeah, growth rates of loblolly pine trees, whatever they are. Let's get a sense of our study organism here. Okay, that's what it looks like. Big pine tree. Yeah, very pretty. And they're just growth rate data. So age, height, and then I'm not sure what seed was. Might be some kind of manipulation. But so there's a natural sort of time series data. If we wanted to say, look at the heights as a function of age, well, that's interesting. And they're because they're tracked. Oh, sorry, seed. That's per individual. So that's like an individual ID. That's what it is. So we've got they've tracked the heights of individual pine trees at various ages. So they've gone out at age 3, measured it 5, 10, 15, 20 years old, 25 years old. And that's all relating to this particular tree. And there are quite a lot of trees in the data set. So it's the individual growth rates of these trees over time, perfect for a line graph if we want to get a bit of a sense of how these things change cumulatively over time. We can see that the base ingredients here are exactly what we've been doing already. A couple of little differences here that we can go through and we can manually play with. So here I've got my data set. It said, hey, ggplot, here's my data. It's one of my 3 key ingredients. My aesthetics here. So I've got an X variable, which is age, because I want age on my X. I want to see how the heights change as a function of age. That's my Y. And I've got this thing called a group variable here. So because I've got 10, 12, 15, I'm not sure how many different individuals, we'll see in a minute. We've got different individuals. I don't just want you to show me the kind of aggregated single line here. I want you to show me every single individual. So I want to see the growth rates per individual. So there's a grouping structure to my data, and how I tell ggplot that I want you to plot a separate line for every individual member of this group is through this group variable here. And that's the variable seed. So if we went back a sec, seed, so these all map onto variables in our data set, height, age, seed, age, height, seed. So one's my X, one's my Y, and one specifies the grouping structure, which is each individual ID. And because it's a line graph, it's just geom line, which is the one we have to remember. Not points, not bar plots, not anything, just geom line. And just from those 2 lines of code then, what I get is this. So here's my ages, here's my heights, and here's the individual. And so for every individual member of that data set, here's how they grow as a function of age. So there's maybe a dozen of them there. So that's what our grouping structure is done here, group, X and Y, it's mapped on this geom, this line onto our aesthetics, our X, our Y, and our group from this data set. So there's our data, aesthetics, our geom. And then all the same tricks apply in terms of building up our little bag here. We can do all the same kind of tweaks that we did beforehand to improve the aesthetics of this plot or to manipulate it a bit. One little extra one we might mess with here, which we just kind of did in those examples, if you got around to it, which I've got in the Google Doc here, is this little trick here. So there are actually more than one way to specify grouping structure in our data. So we can do this group like here. And you can say, well, these are the members of this group. You could also use color instead of group. So they're direct slot-in replacements. The difference in the outcome being that one ultimately colors each individual by default. So if we did the exact same call, except instead of saying group, to specify the grouping structure, the clusters in my data, I can use color instead. And this is the result. So instead of just giving me separate lines, it gives me separate lines that are individually colored according to its own particular defaults. So here's our dozen or so individual seeds, their growth rates, they're separated, a bit more separated visually in terms of color. as to whether or not we like that, or that's worthwhile, or it's pulling our weight. We can have a think about that for sure, but it's just a, there are certain cases in which that might be the case. You might be interested in doing so. Any other tricks? Okay, building on this, what if it's still pretty messy? It's messy in quite a number of ways. But if we're just sort of running some diagnostics here, and I still can't really separate out, like, the information this is giving me is that they're actually all pretty similar in terms of trajectories, but I might be interested in the individual growth rates. Maybe I'm diagnosing it and just want to get a feel for how each individual in my little replicate, my plots here have run their growth. So how do I do that without copying and pasting this, a dozen different times to get a dozen different plots? Well, here's a new trick we can add to our bag. We can facet our plot. And there's this little additional layer, this function called facet wrap, which facets our plots according to some variable that we specify. And so I can say, well, here, and a facet is itself is a plot. So this has like a single facet. It's just this one plot right here. If we want many facets, we can use this facet wrap layer. We can say, well, actually, I want you to create individual plots according to this grouping variable here, seed. All right, so I want an individual plot for every individual seed, and I want them displayed in their own facet. So that's what we can use facet wrap for. What that looks like is this. So here we've got our data, we've got our aesthetics, X and Y. I've gotten rid of the group up here because that's not the way we're doing grouping in this instance. I want line plots, great. And then I'm now adding this facet wrap argument. And we're doing so according to our seed variable. So I want you to create, what this is saying is that I want you to create individual facets for every single seed. And what you get is something like this in the end. So I wouldn't necessarily, for publication purposes, perhaps not so immediately useful, but certainly diagnostically, things like this can be very useful, especially where individual trajectories and whatnot vary, and you're just trying to get a feel for your couple of dozen replicates measurements in different individuals or different colonies or whatever. And so what it's done is same X and Y axes, but here we've got each individual lying on its own little plot there, according to our facet wrap. So it's another handy one. Summarizing a few of those little extra tips that we've just chucked in there as well. So in addition to sort of learning our line, this is what our geom line does. We've got drop-in replacements now. So jitter and point are straight up replaceable. In the same way that group and color arguments are straight up replaceable for specifying grouping structure within our data. One adds color for every member of that group, and one just splits them out by group. And then we can also split things out into individual plots by using this facet wrap to wrap them up all into one big plot with multiple facets for each member of our little group, which can be handy diagnostically and also for creating publication plots, depending on the context there. So there's a few little tips in our roadmap. I think now, just got some line graphs. So this needs a little bit of wrangling to start with, I believe. Oh no, giving us the wrangle, good. So what we need is, I think what this one is just looking to do is let's have a look at the number of counts per year, per genus. And I've kickstarted this, that's basically all the wrangling we need to do there. A few things to think about, but let's just dive in and start creating some nice looking line plots as best as we can, calling on some of our skills there. And we can employ our group and our color and our facet wrap in 3 different ways to start to split out some of this information per genus and sort of decide on what we like better as we go. I will leave this one up there for now. Okay. So what is that there for meters? I'll just wrangle it in shape and then I'll let us all have a play. Let's call it. Okay, so here we have counts of our yearly observations per genus. Cool. Which slightly contrived, but is still technically time series data, so perfect for a line graph. Let's do it. Just grab a drink. I'm going to start building a line graph here. So I am counts per year per genus is what we want. Okay. So my data is yearly counts. Good. My X is per year per genus. All right, yeah, Y equals N per genus. So there are a couple of ways we could do it. So we could group by genus. Check that works. Okay. So there's a different genera by year, by count, but basically looks like what I'm attempting to achieve. A few different ways we could attempt that. We could color. So genus. See how that looks. Pretty wacky color scheme, but arguably a little bit easier to trace because there's one per genus, so we can actually pin them down. So I actually don't mind that. I would change the colors, but be psychedelic. Or we could facet as well. Let's try that as well. So I'll do group version, color version, facet version. Online, so I need to add facet wrap, and I'm wrapping by genus. Okay. It's that way of doing as well. Same X's and Y's throughout. I guess it depends on the goals.
Tom, can you move your graphs to the right a minute so I can see your code?
Sorry. Oh, this good. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
That's great.
Absolutely. Those are my 3 basic versions. I'll stick them in the chat as well. I'm going to throw in my favorite theme. Make that a little prettier. You can see even with the themes there, it's gone further. So it's actually, that's kind of cool. I didn't realize. It's actually reduced down the shared axes as well. So I've just added that theme classic. So it even makes sensible, or it makes decisions anyway as to whether you like them or not, but it's actually deleted all the axes for all these extra plots in the middle here. So it's just got one shared axis, which can be cool if you're into that. I think I probably like the faceting one or the colored maybe. Depends on your goals though. Actually, just while we're here as well, I'll keep that out of the way. But look at that, the cheat sheet. It's also fun to mess around with. Sorry, there's the code still. So here's the cheat sheet, and it should have a bunch of themes on there, which are fun to mess around with to get a sense of what you actually like the look of as well. I thought it did. Oh, here we go. So there are a handful built in. People also have entire packages full of fancy themes that you can download, but really I think the main ones I tend to reach for are classic and sometimes minimal as well. They're both fairly minimal. So this is theme classic, and you can see it's fairly noiseless. There's no backgrounds, none of that kind of stuff. And then if I just swap that out with theme minimal, try and remind myself what that is. What's that one? Okay, so that's a little more. It's not. I actually think the other one is more minimal, arguably, but you know, this has some simple but fairly clean lines, but it's actually gotten rid of those boxes up top by default as well. It actually doesn't have any solid lines for the axes, so that is pretty minimal in that sense. But you know, you can swap these things in and out and just see what you like, and you can always further tweak every single aspect of that. So you could add those little boxes back in if you wanted. You could still get rid of all the gray lines, all that kind of stuff. But it can be nice to maybe mess around with a few themes, see what one you like as a default, and then just half a course whenever you're building a ggplot, just chuck that in as well. And it gives you a nice firm base from which to subsequently build. But I think those two are pretty nice. Theme classic and theme minimal aren't bad to start with. dark, light, classic, gray. I think the default one's pretty ugly, but that's the default. The fill version, you can do I don't think you can use fill as an argument for geom line, sorry, if that's what the question is, if I'm understanding that right. So fill, yeah, sorry, I made this was, fill is an aesthetic argument you can pass to geom point, because it's the inside bit of the point, and you can change the line color on the outside as well. So there's actually 2 bits of color if you want to. The geom line, I'm pretty sure there is no fill in a line. It is just a line, I believe, but we can always double check geom, because if you just look at the help file for every single geom, every geometric object, it'll tell you what arguments it accepts. And so that can also give you ideas for like, oh, those points are kind of ugly, I want to change this, or those lines are annoying because I want this instead. If you just look at the help file, it should tell you exactly what arguments it accepts. So, oh, actually, it's, yeah, okay, so geom line. And then if we keep scrolling down, there's a bunch of stuff here it accepts, but then these are the aesthetics. So we can do the transparency of lines, color of lines, the type of the line. So if you want to mess with that, we could do, if I do line, I think it's a numerical argument, line equals 2. So like if you want a dashed line, let's see if that, I think that's right, for 2. You can do crazy dashed lines. Let's do, I don't know what 3 is, dashes and dots. You can do all that sort of stuff. Yep, that's a dotted line. So that, if I'm back to my help file here, so that's what line type does, cool. And we've got size as well. So I can make it a very fat line or a very skinny line. There's no fill though, so it won't know what to do with fill. And because there's a line, it's not a filled geometric object. But yeah, good question. And the answer is, yeah, just I would jump into the help files. It tells you exactly what each one accepts under this aesthetics heading in the help. Well, I'm kind of happy with that one. If I was to pick one, actually, maybe I like minimal better. Still think I would tweak, probably mess with the axis labels and whatnot, and isn't very informative. Year isn't too bad, but actually somewhere between those 2 plots, but it's pretty good. You know, it's not bad. With a few lines of code, we've got things that are quite informative, and with maybe a touch more, you know, 10 minutes to 3 weeks worth of fiddling, we could have a publication ready plot there. So that's our line graph. We can get very fancy, and you can do things like if you've got means and errors, you can do all that sort of stuff as well, and multiple lines, but we might just churn through the basics first. Pretty tidy. So I'll plonk that. Those are just my bits of mess around code. Also plot that there. And it's also in the chat. Yes, good point. The question is asked, can you put lines connected by points? Because you're exactly right that these aren't technically truly continuous data. They are points connected by lines, but so let's try that. So how would I do that? If I also want an additional, let's start. Let's get rid of that ugly line. So I'll just start with a nice theme, and then a nice base graphic, and then we'll see. So you're right in that these aren't technically continuous data. We've just got data from discrete time points, and so you might also reasonably represent this as a geometric object as a point. So there's a bunch of points. So can we do that? ggplot should just tell us if it's not going to work. But if I just add an extra aesthetic, sorry, an extra geom, So now I'm saying, here's my data, here's my X and Y, and I want you to color it in this way. I want you to, my geometric objects are a line connecting, just a line mapped onto my X and Y, but also I want points. And it should be able to handle that, and it should, yeah, do exactly that. So I think we've jumped ahead a bit in that it's often perfectly possible and preferable to, you might want multiple geometric objects because there are multiple ways of representing your data. And sometimes it's very useful to do, like in this way, which is a good point as well. And arguably that's closer to our key 3 rules of sticking close to the raw data as well, because these are make-believe values in between here, right? So this is the data that we have, and this is nice for visualizing a bit of a time series perhaps, but these are the only real measurements we've taken. And so by adding both the points and the lines, we're actually sticking much closer to our data. So that's a great point. So the answer is, yeah, you can definitely combine multiple geoms, and that's one of the most powerful ways to get really intuitive and sort of high quality visualizations, which I think we'll have a bit of a mess with next in our box plots as well, because box plots are generally terrible by default, but we can do better by doing exactly this kind of thing. Yeah, lovely. That's very nice. You can see how it colors everything. It adds it because these are all global aesthetics that apply to everything, all of our geometric objects. So yeah. Yeah, actually, it's even better. I like that more than my version. All done. Copy and paste that here so people have it as well. Very tidy. Okay, well, we might we might wander on to our next of our big 5 box plots, and then the last 2 are a bit shorter, and we're welcome to jump back and forth, and by all means just yell if there's moving too quick or if anything comes up and we want to spend more time, but there's no harm there. I've been plonking my little ugly chunks of code just in here or in the chat as well, so you're welcome to grab that. You should be able to rebuild what we've just been messing with. The box plots come up all the time, so let's spend a little moment with those. I'm going to close that browser. Learned a few lessons there and a few extra things, and these apply to all these, like facet wrapping. We can do that for all kinds of plots. So we're learning the basics here, and then I've just thrown in, and it's a lot to take in, but some of those hot tips there actually apply to everything. So they're just things that we might want to reach for. So a box plot. Yeah, we've got a numerical variable split by some discrete variable. And it's one that we see all the time and that we often use all the time. Scientists, ecologists, whatever. It's a very common way of representing data. I won't quiz you on this stuff, but that's our medium and our quartiles and our interquartile ranges. Those are our 5-number summary. So a box plot is a summary visualization. So kind of already it violates one of our rules by reaching straight for the box plot, in that it takes us steps away from the raw data very quickly, because it crunches your entire nice continuous distribution of data down to 5 numbers, really, which it uses to represent those data. And the challenge there is that, well, I'll make that point again in a second, but these are CO2 data. So these are built in. Again, this will run in R. If you just type these words in, that's a built-in data set. It looks like it's a CO2 uptake data from trees that are exposed to either chilled or unchilled. So there's an experimental manipulation here. Our outcome variable is our uptake of CO2 at various levels of concentration. So I think it's a factorial design here. There's a chill treatment, and then at various concentrations of CO2, they record the uptake, which is our outcome variable. It's what we've actually been measured. So we can build one. If we start, again, using our layered approach here, we can have a think about how we might want to build a box plot. We start with our CO2 data. So, hey, ggplot, here's my data, CO2. On my X variable, you've got this treatment here, chilled or non-chilled. And what we've measured is our CO2 uptake. So whatever that is, rates of uptake. We could, if we just plonked it as represented it as our geometric object as a point, then you can see exactly what it's done here. It's put each of our individual measurements here and it's split them by our two treatments, because our X is a categorical variable. So it's only got two levels, chilled and non-chilled. Y is continuous. So that's exactly what it's done. And you can see that even when we use geometric objects that aren't quite, like that's not a very good way of representing our data, but it's done it because it takes you very literally. ggplot takes you very literally. So it said, well, okay, you told me that X is categorical and Y is continuous and you want points. So here you go. And the result's a bit weird. So if you got that, you'd maybe rethink whether that's exactly explicitly what you wanted. But if we tell it to do it, it'll do it as best as possible. And that's what you can get. If we instead reach for geom boxplot, it does the hard work of like summarizing those data. So it summarizes those into our 5 key points there, and instead plots our big boxes. And they're pretty ugly and awful. But nonetheless, that's our box plot. There's our median and our interquartile ranges, 25 and 75% there. And we can get a sense of what's going on here. So it looks to me like, non-chilled treatment, the CO2 uptake is indeed slightly increased beyond our chilled treatment as well. So we've got our ingredients, data, aesthetics, geometric object, which we've said is a box plot. And what you get is a box plot. But as I've said, it is box plots by default defy our principle of sticking close to the raw data. But there are some pretty easy solutions that that go a long way to helping us out. And it also just helps now, and we've got some of these tricks up our sleeve, and including one that we just learned. And it starts to illustrate a bit more of the flexibility of ggplot2 by adding layers, and then thinking in this layered term, thinking in terms of layers, building up our visualizations iteratively. So that's, we're too far away from the raw data for my mind, and this makes the point. So these are, 7 different distributions, right? Vastly different distributions, but because we're crunching them down to a 5-star summary, 5-point summary, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what you're getting is a tremendous masking of the actual dynamics of what's going on in your data set. So that's what I mean in terms of, that's why we want to stay as close as possible to our raw data. Box plots and things like it that rely on summary data rather than the raw stuff mask a lot of really important information. And so they can ultimately unintentionally mislead or intentionally mislead if that's your purpose. But these are all very different distributions giving rise to exactly the same summary data and hence the exact same visualization, even though the decisions we might make based on these data, are very, very different in the inferences we might make. So we can start to build on that trick that we just learned then in terms of combining multiple geoms. And one simple way we can do it with our box plot. We can get some pretty cool stuff just by adding some points. So we can actually just add on the raw data, almost in what we were just doing there, except instead of replacing our points with our box plot, we can actually just combine them and see how that gets us. So you can see all I've done here is, well, here's my data. Here are my aesthetics, X and Y. I want you to give me a box plot. That's my main geometric object. But also I want some points. I want both of them. Give it all to me, and ggplot takes you very literally, and it does so. And so this is what we get. And that's okay. That's not bad. It's certainly better because now we've actually got summary data, and we're no longer actually breaking our rule of being quite far removed from our raw data, because our raw data are right there. We know exactly these values are exact. So that's better in terms of violating one of our rules. Still a bit ugly, so it's still breaking some of our others. But nonetheless, we're on the road, so we can keep thinking. I think we can do better. And so why don't we do something like pulling on those tricks that we learned before as well. So in terms of our points, we've done 3 things in one step here. So instead of geom point, instead of just plunking my points down, I've added a bit of jitter. And I've added jitter only in one dimension. So I've messed with the width of these things. So on this x-axis, that's all we've done. We've jittered them left to right. So they're still exactly perfectly accurate in the dimension that counts on our y here, because those values are still exactly what they are. But this is one of those cases where jitter really only improves the situation, because this doesn't matter. It's still very clearly belonging to one of these 2 categories. and we haven't actually changed the Y values at all. But visually, huge improvement, because I can now separate those points. You can see it even helps me with that grouping structure a bit, and I can start to eyeball the distribution a bit better than I could certainly here, where there's a lot of overplotting going on. That, to my mind, is much nicer. I've also just thrown in a bit of transparency because it helps. I find that all of that big, heavy, solid black is quite visually heavy. So I like a bit of transparency, but that's just an aesthetic decision. So I think we're doing better there. Whoops. And we can mess with the boxes themselves. So there's still quite a few things we can do here. But if I looked at the help file for this geometric object, this geom box plot, I would see that it accepts an argument called width. And I find the default boxes are quite ugly and wide. So let's shrink those up a bit. You might even go a touch narrower, or you might mess with the level of jitter here. It's the kind of thing I just spend way too long fiddling with. But nonetheless, that's a big improvement from that, to my mind, to my eye anyway. So even just in those couple of little tweaks there, we've gone a long way. We've kind of stopped violating several of our rules there, but the most important of which is undoubtedly sticking close to the data, because we can now kind of eyeball the distribution of our data. You can see they're both kind of semi-normal anyway, aren't they? There's kind of a cluster around the median. Aesthetically, it's better. I think we can even still do better. I think there are still things. Well, it's not even a new trick now, because we already we punched through ahead, but we can certainly keep improving and start drawing in our themes. And as I said, my favorites are like minimal or classic. So I think that's all I'm doing here. So let's just, again, by default, reach for our main theme. Oh, look how much better that is. You know, all the way from that initial big, wide, ugly box that's far removed from our raw data, through just a couple of little extra layers and a little bit of iteration. We've come to something that's much more visually informative, that's, to my eye, aesthetically much more pleasing. I think there's still probably a couple of things, what do I say, there's still things I would tweak, but this was me a year ago, so let me have a think about what does bug me about this. What would people, would anyone else tweak anything? I think the Y label.
I'd like to increase the font size on the labels.
That's a good one as well. Yeah, no, for sure, we could do that. Well, that's a good one. Font size is too small. The plot itself, depending on, yeah, and ggplot does actually, I find the defaults when you save them there are actually a bit tiny. I am often messing with the font. There are no units on that Y-axis label, and that one has caps and this one doesn't, so that would bug me. I think fixing that. I don't know what else. Not too bad. Non-chilled and chilled, they're okay. The Y range, for my mind, I don't know where the 0 is, but it doesn't start at 0 explicitly, which would bug me because it's close enough. So you definitely want, and generally on a Y-axis, you want it to start at 0 as a rough rule. Not always, but I think generally you do. Those are probably the big ones. Yeah, I would agree with those. So maybe there's more than 2. And yeah, we could definitely bump up the font as well, which I can show you how to do. We would have to mess with the theme. But even that, so that's, what have I done there? I've just given myself a custom Y label, which actually, even now I'm getting really fussy. That sits a little bit too close to those numbers for me. So I would bump that out a little bit as well, which you can do. You can do everything. I would have to Google that because I've already forgotten how to do it, but it's a little tweak to the theme. I'm sure I could do that. That's nicer. I've got a Y axis that starts at 0. That's nicer. Too chilled. So, you know, once we're kind of getting the feel for these things, maybe a couple of quick Google queries, you know, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and you've got something that's aesthetically quite nice. Certainly far better than anything you do in, you know, your Excels or whatever with a bunch of clicking around. You can definitely achieve it. Just takes longer for my mind. And it's the kind of thing we can just reuse and reproduce as well. You just steal from yourself. You know, once you kind of got a good box plot, you just borrow your own code from way back when and keep reusing it. Once you've figured out aesthetically what kind of looks nice. But that is much better. And within argument, it fulfills all of our rules as well. There's the raw data there, summarizes it nicely. So it can make a simple point. Non-chilled is higher than chilled, but it doesn't do so in a way that obscures our raw data. It's nice and clean and simple. I've thought about every single element in there, background, point color, line thickness, box width, absolutely everything is the way it is because I want it to be exactly that way. Treatment labels, all of that sort of stuff. And so I think it wins for us. And there are a few things we just learned in there and that we've touched on previously, but we can mess with our limits quite simply. So you might reach for these pretty often, xlim and ylim. Excellent. So it's ylim there. You can do the same for xlim. It wouldn't do anything here. But ylim, so you can explicitly set your axes quite simply with xlim and ylim. Xlab and ylab do the same for the labels. So I often reach for those two because generally things aren't labeled very nicely off the bat. And we, again, just use our themes. So, mess with all the themes once, a couple of times through, find the one that you like the best as a default and just use it every time you use ggplot2. Theme classic and theme minimal are pretty good, I reckon, to reach for. And they help us exercise some pretty fine control over our data. So I think we're box plotting, and there might have been something. I'm always up for assign a plot to an object and put it in brackets, and name it, but also display. Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay. So if you. Okay. I think I follow you. Yeah. All right. I'll try that. In terms of naming and displaying objects. Add that to my plot tips. Thanks. So yeah, well, let's have a crack at mess with some box plots. So for this one, I think I've asked us to weights within each genus. Okay. So let's get weights within each genus. I don't think we need any wrangling for this. So it's just straight into plotting for us. So I'll just get mine going. I'm gonna start with we'll get a basic ugly one going, and then I reckon pull on your whole bag of tricks that we've been playing with there to try and get something that you would actually be worthy of, that doesn't violate all our rules. So I'll start with again. What did I say? Weights. Nope. Genus. Yep. All right, so I'll just move that out of the way. Sorry, there's the bit of code. That's my bit of code just to get the box plot up and running. There are many, many things awful and ugly and wrong with this. So I reckon you could do it a long way to get better than that. Pulling on our little bag of tricks. So it'll give us a few minutes to do that, and then I'll have a crack at it myself. Things like, so adding our raw data, getting a nice theme to get rid of that ugly background and everything. Those axis labels need some work. Those outliers are annoying, so but that might be a Google query, but I can show you how to get rid of outliers. Or if you look at the help file, if we look at the help file for GM boxplot, the answer will be in there as well for our outliers. So if you don't want them, all right, have a look at the help file for GM boxplot, and that should be in there. And I do think you want to get rid of those because we're plotting if we want to plot our raw data as well, they'll just be overlapping, and that'll be really ugly. What else might we do? Transparency on the points, maybe. That again. Yeah, feel free to whack your finished products in here as well. I always like to see what people come up with. Yeah, those are the big ones. You could reorder that if you wanted to, put it from like highest to lowest. That would take some wrangling skills as well. System has fallen asleep. I'll have to add that to my hotspot tip. Nice one. I don't think I've done that before. So why assign it? So put this whole thing in brackets and then like that. Oh wow, okay. So plus it. Oh, is that why I see that? Yeah. Okay. Learn something new, but it's also in test plot. Yeah, okay, cool. Oh, there you go. Hot tip. That's one. All right, I'm going to start making mine less awful. Check a theme in there. Yeah, it's a bit better. All right. What else would I do? I want to add some points. These are slow. Okay, well, they exist, but they're very ugly. And one thing you'll notice as well, I shouldn't go through it, because R reads top to bottom like humans do. It matters what order you call your different geons in. So if I've said, here's my plot. First, I want you to add some boxes. Second, I want you to add some points. But you'll see if I flip the order of them and say, first, I want you to put down the points. Then I want you to add the boxes. The boxes should actually obscure the points because they're opaque. There you go. See, so our points here are actually obscured by the box because I've said do the points first, and on top of that, draw my boxes. So it just matters if things aren't quite turning up how you might like, or you see them vanishing behind other things. It's because the order in which you call these things actually doesn't matter. So that's worth thinking about. All right, so what do I say? Let's have a look at the help form. Geom box plot. Let's look at the help file. So here we go. Box and Liska plot, and I want to get rid of these outliers. So these arguments with outlier in them look pretty promising to me. And I'm pretty sure it's shape is the one we want. It might even tell us outlier. Default aesthetics set to null. Sometimes it can be useful to hide the outliers. Here we go. So this is good. Set outlier shape to NA, and that'll get rid of those outliers. So it'll chuck them out. Still uses them to calculate all the summary data, so that's good, but it just doesn't display them. So GM box plot, and what do we do? Outlier shape equals NA. Looks good to me. That'll throw those out, which is good. Good. So it's got rid of the outliers, which I can show you if I hide my points first. There you go. No more outliers. Much better. Because I've got my points there anyway. I don't want points though. I'm going to add jitter. Oops. Jitter. And I'm going to make them a little bit transparent because I liked that earlier. See how that goes. Whoa. Okay, it's a bit wild. Yeah. Definitely do better than that. So what's going on? I think the width is, I think they're too wide. It's too much jitter. Yeah, there's still water jitter, but I forgot how much. I forgot there's 30,000 points of data. So this might be one of those cases where, yeah. And you know what, in this instance, let's see what it looks like if I actually put the boxes on top, which might actually be useful in this case. Yeah, that doesn't really thrill me either. Yeah, okay, nice. Maybe the dot. Yeah, you could. Can we? That's some great ideas and thoughts come out here. So can we? Yeah, can you add transparency to the box rather than the points? That's possible. I don't know. I'll have a look in the help files, and maybe colors as well could help. Yeah. If anyone's come up with something they're particularly happy with, I'd be happy to see it. Yeah. So that's what have I done there? Box. That just swamps those boxes. All right, that's no good. Let's have a quick look in the. I like how everyone's thinking. For sure. So GM box plot. Yeah, it does take alpha. So maybe that would be something worth playing with. Maybe we could mess with the color of our points as well, like was mentioned. You're right that the black is visually heavy. Maybe gold isn't the perfect, but I know what you mean. Something visually lighter that could help. Something in kind of an ugly mustard, but it's still not working for me. But yeah, I think getting away from black, maybe that would help. Let's have a look at transparency on the box itself. Maybe that'll help. Yeah, a less jitter is helping for you, I reckon. Okay. So that sounds good. And why don't we add alpha equals 0. I don't know what a transparent, whoops, box looks like. So I've done it before. Oh yeah, okay. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I think that's getting, maybe honing in on something I'm happier with. So adding a bit of maybe putting the box on top, but adding a bit of transparency to the box. I quite like that actually, that vibe. I think the points are a bit, see that's tricky. The points are too transparent over here because now Sigmadon's lost because there's like 30,000 points here and 10 here, but that's, the transparent box is cool. I like that. Yeah, in which case we can probably go a little heavier with the visual weight on the points, so I can make them I can jack that alpha back up a bit. I don't know, it's 2. Let's see what that does. Yeah, didn't jitter them as much. So that's, yeah, okay. There are a few challenging things about this data set as we're all now discovering, as just the sheer volume of points makes it hard to, can make it a little tricky to stick to our, to create a visually informative way of sticking to our golden rule of staying close to the raw data. I think
I don't know if, sorry, I just wanted to ask, I don't know if that's something that you're going to be talking about later and we should just focus on the points. But wouldn't it better for us to use maybe a violin to
yeah, you could
put the thingy instead of the points, because then it's not as messy. Yeah, for sure. I actually don't in this one, but you're exactly right that if you're running up against situations like this as well, you may even just start, once your repertoire builds up a bit, you may start reaching for other plots altogether. Violins are okay. They can be neat. I quite like rain cloud plots, I think they're called, where they've got like a box and then a density plot next to it. They can be quite cool. Yeah, you're exactly right. And then no, we won't tackle it, but if you start hitting a wall on some of these things and you're like, well, this just isn't working, that may also be a call to start exploring and looking a little further. Yeah, I think there are those pirate plots that makes both box plot and violin together.
Oh, is that a pirate?
Pirate plot, yeah. The name of the it's like R.
Yeah. So this is what I was vaguely imagining.
Yeah.
There are these things called like rain cloud plots, which you can do this kind of a thing. It's a little beyond us today, but yeah, or you can basically combining some kind of density plot with a box plot in some way or other. Some of these are a bit ugly, but something with a density could work better when there's so many data points. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
As I remember that rain cloud plot, half of it is also a violin plot.
Yeah, it's half of a,
pirate plot. I haven't heard of pirate plots before. So that's a double-sided violin with a, so it's a mirror. See, yeah, violin. No, that's a look. Yeah, see, I don't like, apart from the general hilarity of them, violin plots, I don't like the symmetry of them because that suggests that it's kind of, there's redundant information there. And I don't know, the symmetry of them has always bugged me a little bit. When combined with something else, though, it can be useful. Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think, yeah, I'd be reaching for so a pirate looks closer, or a rain cloud. I think those kind of things. Yeah, when you've got a lot of data, that's a pretty cool, that can be quite nice. Some of these are a bit busy, but you know, a pirate plot. You learn something new. I hadn't heard of those. That's cool. Violins by themselves, yeah, I don't really like. So you'd want to combine them with something. So yeah, I don't think that's great. Pirates or rain clouds, but yeah, it's a great point. If we start to hit the limitations of what we're capable of here, I think here the challenge is just the sheer volume of data and the disparity between categories as well. But I think we're doing okay. Like I wouldn't be too offended to see this. It would be better than just seeing a box plot anyway. And I didn't realize you could add transparency to boxes and stuff. That's pretty cool. Oh, nice. Yeah, thanks, Jill. Pirate plots. Okay. Oh yeah, more descriptive inferential. Interesting. Cool. Some reading. later on. Yeah, interesting. But I love just everyone's thinking in exactly the right way. So that's really cool. All these suggestions you've all thrown in here in terms of you're doing all the thinking is spot on. And that's just those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves. And it's yeah, and it's fab. I'll put that in the chat just because that's my decent-ish box plot with crowdsourced solutions, but yeah, there's certainly filling to be done. I'd pick a less ugly color. I always need to Google colors to see what they've actually got. And there are pre-built palettes and stuff as well, but I always end up with this PDF flicking through things. But yeah, some great suggestions. It's not too bad. Nice rain cloud would do the trick. Also need to fix up those labels. I'm okay with the axes there because it starts at 0. I maybe put in a few more ticks. There's 0 and 200 seems a bit, that's pretty sparse for my liking. So I'd probably be putting in, I don't know, at least 50, 51, 52, probably have a look depending on what my aims are, of course, but yeah, at least an extra one in there. That's a bit of a naked y-axis. Yeah. Y-lab. It's kilograms. X label. Genus, just so it's capitalized like the other one. Actually, no, wait, let's do this. Let's see if we know how to do this. Try manually, so it's a I'll just see if I can remember this, then I'll explain it. Yeah. All right. Ah, cool. Yeah, all right. So that's good. If you want, just adding to our little bag here. So I've messed with my X label and Y label, which we sort of knew how to do. But if you want really fine-grained control over what your labels, what your axes, how they're scaled, then you need to reach for these scale arguments here. So you've got scale Y or scale X, depending on which axis you want to actually mess with the scale for. And then this last argument will be either discrete for a discrete axis, like here, for categorical axes, or it'll be continuous if it's continuous data. So I want to mess with the scale of my y-axis, which is continuous, so scale y continuous. You can look at the help files in there and it'll tell you all sorts of fancy customizations that you can do. But I just wanted to set the breakpoints. So the breakpoints are these, where the ticks appear. And here I've just said breaks. I want breaks. I want one at 50, 100, 152, 250. And a simple way of doing that is to create a little sequence. So I could have manually typed in 0, 51, 152, 250. But here I've just run this little thing, which is a little function sequence, run it from 0 to 250 in increments of 50. So I could have manually typed that in, or I just use this. And so what that's then given me is 0, 51, 152, 250. So I've got nice fine scale control, and that's better. That's much better, I think. So I'm going to plonk that in the chat as well. So that's probably my best crack, given the constraints of those data. But you're right, and that'll be all right, depending on the context. I might even reach for a different kind of a plot down the line, something more advanced like a rain cloud. But I think you need to download packages for those. You can cobble them together, but they're tricky. Yeah. Really nice work. Some lovely visualizations coming together. Where is my... Now in a couple, we're going to some slightly, maybe arguably less often published probably, but you know, often used. And so we, you know, some of our big five, so we might grab them. Look at histograms, which are just really nice for looking at distributions. And as I said, you tend not to see them so much in publications, but they're extremely useful diagnostically. For getting a feel for our data, I'm constantly using histograms. When you're running stats, right, you need residuals and data. You just need to know what the distributions look like and how they feel. What's the biggest and smallest value? You know, where's the median? Where's the middle of it? How are they spread? Do they have multiple peaks? All sorts of things. Is it uniform? Is it normal? What are the most common? And so it's a really powerful visualization that we do often reach for. And it's a histogram. So in terms of the geometric object in ggplot2, they've called it geomhist, which is nice. And the way we do it, so I'll just use that same data set. This is a built-in data set into R. And so we can do something like this. And you'll notice that there's only, so we've got our data. So here I've just done a little bit of wrangling. So I'm just pulling out, I just want to see like the chilled, the data from the chilled treatment. So that's all this is doing. I'm saying filter my little CO2 data set. Because all I want to see is those chilled treatment, or you could just feed in the whole thing if you wanted to, but just for the sake of visualization here. And now I'm mapping it, but you'll notice that there's only an X, so there is no Y in histograms, right? Because it's like frequency bins. So I just need to tell it how I want this thing to be grouped by. So group it in terms of uptake for me, which is one of the variables in our data set. And I want geometric, the geom that I want is a histogram. And so here here's my uptake value. So here's my various values for uptake and the number of times that just accounts the number of times that we see each of those values. And so that's a pretty basic sort of histogram. It's pretty ugly. So it's even diagnostically, I'm not sure it's not as useful arguably as it could be. So we might make some simple tweaks, but that's, yeah, I mean, that's a sort of a bimodal distribution there within our little chilled data set, I would say. It's a bit of a clunky one, but again, I just pop into the help files. There are some things on the face of it that I'd want to do, things I don't like, you know, the usual stuff, backgrounds and labels. If I care about it, it's just diagnostic, I might not worry, but certainly I kind of want to be able to see those categories a bit better. And another big thing with histograms that you might want to control is the extent of binning. So it'll just pick some sensible values to start with, but you might want larger or smaller bin widths. So do you want everything from 20 to 30 to be chucked into one big bin? Or do you want to see every integer value, for example? And that helps you get a finer sense of the distribution. And they're very common things that you might want to manually control. So here I've done some of that. This is exactly the same up top. But in my histogram here, if I look at the help file and see what kind of arguments it takes, I can change the width of those bins to 1 unit. So for one bar should represent everything between 0 and 1, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4. So widths of 1. And I want the outline color to be white, just so I can actually distinguish them a little bit better. You can see that it started to change it's the same distribution, of course, but it's changed the visualization certainly. So you can get a bit more fine-grained information there. I still don't like the background in that, but if I'm just diagnosing things, that's fine. So I've just, yeah, as I said, separated those bars a bit, visually separated those things so I can see the distinction between my categories. And I've just messed with the bin width as well, so I can actually see a little bit more information there. Seem to be clumping them by about 2 or 3, and I just wanted them by 1. But so that's a pretty clunky way of doing it here. So here I've looked at one treatment, but we've already learned that there are some slightly better ways in which we can tell ggplot that we've got grouping structure in our data. So we can do this a bit better if we want to say, compare the distributions of our values between our 2 treatments, our chilled and our non-chilled. We don't need to create 2 plots. We've learned a couple of tricks, and there are a couple of other ways we can do it. We could think about faceting these things. Maybe we could separate them by treatment all on the one plot. And we can start to do that. So there are two options, or there are a few options, but a couple of obvious ones. We can do, we can add a fill argument here. So instead of, whereas in some of our previous plots, we had our X variable and our Y variable, and we either had color or a group. Those were both interchangeable ways of specifying some grouping structure. We can also add fill. And now it's fill here instead of color, because when you've got a geometric object that can actually be filled in, like a point or a bar, then fill is the thing that specifies the internal color, whereas color is for the outside line that's actually drawn. So because it's because it's got a non-zero thickness, because a bar is something that can be filled in, unlike a line, which can't, but a point can. We can actually use fill here as another drop-in replacement to specify our grouping structure. And it's just gone ahead and picked the default colors, which are these weird sort of orangey and teal or whatever that is. I'm actually terrible with colors, but whatever those two are. And it's got some defaults and it's plonked them all on one. And so, yeah, I mean, it depends on our goals here. So if you want to directly compare two distributions, you know, that's okay, but it's not maybe not as good as it could be. We've got some other options, but that's certainly one of them. Everything else is pretty much the same here. I've just said change the fill. And this position equals dodge just means that I want them on the same plot, but I want you to offset them. So I want you to slot each bar side by side for me. So dodge each other. Otherwise it would try and plot them right on top of each other. And it would be even less interpretable. You can kind of, if you just focus on one at a time, you can see how the distributions differ, but yeah, there are other ways to do it. We could also separate them. So using this facet wrapping, exactly what we were just doing before. So I want them on two separate plots or two separate facets of the one plot. We could just do that with our facet wrap argument here, just like we did before. I want you to split them by treatment. And then we get something like that. And if our goal, yeah, again, is to compare two distributions, I'd say that's arguably a visually simpler way. Once I've also gone on to clean things up around here, like all the backgrounds and the titles and whatnot, I think that's probably an easier way to do it if I'm looking to just eyeball the difference or similarity between two distributions, because they share a y-axis, or it's expressed on the same scale there. They share an x-axis, so I can see, all right, this one's kind of bimodal, this one's fairly normal. So here's sort of the center of this distribution. This is kind of the center of this distribution, but it's bimodal. So these are the most frequent values. You know, I can get all of that rich diagnostic information in a slightly simpler way than I could off something like that, where I've got to almost, you know, fuzz your eyes and focus on one color at a time and figure out what's going on. Oh, okay. When it was as simple as that, there also, which we can go into as a slight variation on the histogram, but let's just crack on with these. We could, keeping on the theme of reaching for different plots, a density plot might be a drop-in replacement for something like a histogram. And I can show you how that works as well. It's just G on density. And I think it's pretty well a drop-in replacement for our histogram. But let's build a couple of histograms quickly, mess with our tool, mess with our tips. I think we're just looking at the histogram. Let's build a histogram of the weights of all of our animals. And then I think we're doing it by genus as well. So we'll split them up. So histogram of our weights, split them up by genus, and then make it look pretty using all of the things we keep learning. Maybe using facets, maybe using grouping, colors, themes, all of that stuff. Building up that little toolkit that we've already got. So genome histogram, right? I'm going to get, as usual, I'll get my standard ugly version going. And then we'll see how much we can improve on that. But that eco clean. I'm only specifying X because that's all that matters. And what do I say? Weight plus Yeah, so that's pretty uninformative and pretty ugly because there's a lot of different genera mashed in there. It's visually a mess. We could improve on that a lot. So we'll give it 5 and then we'll fix it up. Yeah. So the goal is to compare and contrast the distribution of weights between genera. That's our visual aim here. We're going to eyeball distribution of weights among each of our genera. I think I'd be reaching for facets just because we've got so many genera to compare. And I think there's a way to visually do it on one graph. So I might start by assuming that I'll have to facet wrap. Looks like that. Yeah, okay. There's some other challenges here. I was going to go ahead and reach for my favorite theme, as I will just do from now on. Theme classic. So that'll immediately tidy it up a little bit. The weights are okay, but there's also a visual problem here in that they're very, very different numbers of occurrences. So you can see that the range of values on the Y here, by default, our box plot locks in. It just assumes when you're facet wrapping like this, it assumes you want exactly the same scale for the Y and exactly the same scale for the X. But here's a case where it kind of breaks down because it's scaling naturally by this, it has to, for this largest one here. So there are almost 6,500 count weights among our dipdomists. But by ranging it from 0 to 6,000, we can can't see anything about a sigma done. I'm pretty sure we can just let those y-axes freely, we can make them independent, which is a trade-off. But if I have a look in the old help file for geom, what I'm doing, or reaching for Google, I'm just going to keep scrolling because I'm pretty sure I can let those y-axes flow freely. And for the life of me, I can't remember the argument, so I'm going to have to revert to Google. Shameful secret. Let's get a facet. Oh, okay. So it's an option in facet wrap. Is that why I missed it? Scales. Ah, there we go. Okay. So there's this scales argument that we could use in our facet wrap. And what that lets us do, by default, it says you want the same axis and x-axis and y-axis on all of our plots, but that might not be the case for reasons we can see here. So why don't I say fixed, free, or free in one dimension? Well, let's just go scales equal free. That shouldn't matter. Let's see what that does. Yeah, nice. So that's much better. So now we just need to be cautious that the y-axes actually vary from plot to plot, but nonetheless, if our goal is to compare distributions between all our genera, then this is a much more effective way of doing it, because we can actually see these, whereas we couldn't before. So that's really nice. Just because we've used this scales equals free argument, we said, well, let all our x-axes and our y-axes be free. To just pick sensible defaults for every one of our facets, which it has. That's pretty nice. What else could I do? I reckon we change the bin widths a little bit. Yeah, it's very nice. Yeah, actually, I don't think that's much better in terms of bin widths, but those are nonetheless things we would mess with. I think with the biggest changes, biggest help there for me was freeing up those axes. So that's not too useful. See some real bimodal distributions here, some normal, some skewed, some outliers. Yeah, in general, it's much more effective. All right, I'm gonna stick my little solution there, but you may have an improvement on that for sure. There's a lot we could still fix up there. But as a basic working prototype, not too bad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What else could we do if you wanted to? But again, just sometimes just browsing through the help files of each of these things as the first couple of times you learn them, and then you'll learn a couple of new tricks. Another one in this, when you're faceting things like this, you might want to control exactly how many rows and how many columns these things get smushed into. So you can take this argument, for example, I'm looking in the help file here of facet wrap. You can actually just explicitly note the number of rows or columns you want. So I could, if I want those all mashed into 2 columns rather than this 3, 3, 2 layout, I could do ncol equals 2, and I should just smush them all into 2 columns. There you go. So that's actually not a bad way of doing it as well. Visually kind of simpler and helps me compare up and down just in 2 goes rather than having 3. So that you could mess with that. That's actually not bad. I don't like the bin widths anymore, but yeah, lots of little options in there, and the help files in these are pretty great. So just first time you use them, second, third time you use them, have a bit of a poke through at some of the common options that you might like to mess with. And again, once you've kind of get a feel for your personal sort of defaults, it just becomes quicker and quicker, and you rip yourself off each time. All right, bit of a quick finish, but it's also one of the lesser plots really that we don't as often reach for, but they're occasionally useful. Really, it's just for our bar plots are just for looking at the distribution of categorical variables, really. So that's a nice example there. Or life expectancy was a terrible example earlier on, but basically counts the distribution of across different categories. We might reach for a bar plot. Counts or proportions, yes, that's right. If you ever find yourself reaching for, as I think I might say at the end here, really it is just sort of counts and proportions tend to be it. If you ever find yourself adding error bars to a bar plot, don't use a bar plot. You know, you'd be wanting a box plot or something instead with those raw data, because it just obscures far too much information. It's also visually, it doesn't visually make sense because you've got all this weight, this visual weight coming up from the bottom, and it's just, so if you ever find yourself reaching and trying to Google how to add error bars to a bar plot, just don't, just go for a box plot instead or something else. But certainly I'd be reaching for a box plot with raw data on top as a pre-built sort of example. Two ways to build a bar plot with ggplot, and it just depends on whether the data, what form the data are in. There's geom_col if your data are already pre-counted in their various categories, or geom_bar if they aren't, and then it does the summarizing for you. And I'll show you what I mean here. So here's some raw data. So they're really just a bunch of entries in our categories. So we've got 2 butterflies, 2 crickets, and a bee or whatever here. So that's what I mean in a raw sense. They're just, each entry is its own entrant in a category, or if they're pre-counted in a little, like a summary table here. So 2 Lepidoptera, 2 Orthoptera, 1 Hymenoptera, rather than lep, orthop, Hymenoptera. So that's what I mean by pre-counted. That's what I mean by raw. And it just depends on which we then plot the two. So we're using geom_col here for our pre-counted data and geom_bar for our raw data. I never get it right the first time, so you just try both of them and then one of them will work. For our two types, exactly the same outcomes. It doesn't matter ultimately. It's just whatever form your data happen to be in. And the only difference being here as well that we have to specify both the X and the Y for our pre-counted data, because it won't know, right, which is the X and which is the Y. Whereas you've only got one variable for our bar plot here. So you just need to tell it X. That's where my data are stored in that variable. You count them up. Otherwise here I say, here are my counts and here's my actual grouping variable here. And that gives us our little bar plot. All the same rules apply in terms of making these look less awful. And I think this is me just making that point that if you ever do reach for those, yeah, if you want to put error on there, just do something. There are much more informative kinds of plots for some obvious reasons. That breaks our big rule. So it masks a lot of information. Aesthetically and visually, it doesn't make sense because you've got means here, but there's all this visual weight being taken up by the stretching down to 0. So it kind of suggests it's coming up, there's information there when it's not. It's just a point. It's just a mean. So it's kind of deceptive, perceptually misleading, as well as just uninformative and breaking our raw data rules. I think I've just got this last little point that there's actually quite a nice way, quite a handy little save helper function here as well, which is ggsave. So when we've got our beautiful plots and you want to actually save these things, there is a neat little function called ggsave, which is part of the whole universe. At its simplest, you just call ggsave and you name the plot, or you name the file. So whatever you want the resulting file to be, and that can look like this. So if I just called ggSave and named my little file here, my bar plot, and I gave it an extension, so a PNG file or a JPEG or a TIFF, I could just call that is a self-contained line of code right there, and it'll just make some sensible guesses about the size of that plot and the width and height and all that kind of stuff. So it just does its best, and it'll apply that to whatever the last plot you just created was. So if you interactively build a bar plot, just called gsave, and that would take my last plot. It would save a file on my computer called my bar plot. It would make it a PNG file. It would take some sensible guesses as to the size and whatnot. And great, then you've got a lovely plot sitting on your computer. But you can build that out as much as you want. So if you want to tell it exactly which plot, if you've saved all your plots as objects, for example, here I've saved one as insect bar plot. So that's an object in my R session. So here I'm specifically saving this plot as my blahplot.jpg, but it's still going to take some sensible guesses as to dimensions and whatnot. Or we could go on and so on and actually specify the width of these things, the height of them, the units that I want, that I'm telling you to measure these things in, the resolution, all of that kind of stuff. You could just have a look at the help file for ggSave, specify everything, or you can specify basically nothing except the name of it, and it'll do its best. But it does quite well in guessing these things. And I think we can make a couple of bar plots. But I mean, what do we got? We can make some bar plots, but are there any, what we've attempted to do today anyway, just to get a big, a couple of rules of thumb for getting us through making nice graphics. It was really just an introduction, like we've also touched upon. There's just so many cool things you can, other more complex and sophisticated visualizations we can get through, but those are really strong foundations for our ggplotting anyway. We've learned how to do it in ggplot and get a bit of a sense of how that works, data, aesthetics, geoms. And we can see that once you start to build up your little handful of kind of basic plots and basic visual manipulations, you get some pretty nice results pretty quickly. And once you get a bit of a feel for it, you just copy yourself off into the future. But it's easier and more reproducible in the long run, I think, to get some pretty nice publication quality graphics over sort of the base R or your Excels or whatnot. Are there any, if there's any questions at all? Happy to hear them for sure. Otherwise, what have we got? I mean, I'll hang out and make a bar plot for sure.
I have a question actually, Tom.
Yeah.
So you know how, and again, I know that this is more basics and there are lots of other ways that we could do this, but you know that when we are doing a model, there are many variables that we are taking into account, and sometimes sorry, just let me put the cat down. When we put this plot as as a box plot, for example, it doesn't take the model into account. It kind of just puts the raw data, right? So sometimes we're showing, oh, I have a very big difference between treatment A and treatment B, but then you put in a box plot and all the bars are overlapping, and as much as they are not, you know what I mean? So what would you say there would be is it still better to show it that way? Is it just people should be used to?
It's a great question. It comes down to so raw data, but raw data can also be like, residuals from plots or predictions from models, whilst also controlling for other variables, for example. Like raw data doesn't, I suppose maybe I was keeping it simple. Raw is in like the stuff that the measurements you took from that animal, but I would also consider things like, the predicted values when holding other variables constant in terms of the output of from the outputs of a model, for example. The individual observations and the individual predictions from that model would also be raw in that sense, which is, maybe closer to what you're talking about, where if you just had like a box plot of heights, but you're not taking into account these other things, your stats say that there's this big effect, but you're kind of, it's pretty subtle and basically hidden when you're just plotting the raw data. I'd just maybe say take raw and, those rules of thumb, take them in context. And we haven't, we didn't, this is just a real intro. So you can totally do all that kind of stuff, like, plotting variables and model fits or predicted values when holding other things constant and all that kind of stuff. Exactly the same framework and tools. And ggplot actually has some really clever built-in ways of plotting model fits that you can just chuck in there, like in your scatter plots and whatnot. You can actually just tack on linear model fits right in the plot. So yeah, that would probably be my convoluted answer. Raw can mean a couple of different things, and for sure there are fancier ways to do things when we're getting into modeling, but yeah, we just haven't today maybe had time for that kind of stuff.
No, yeah, but you answered my question, because I was wondering how raw the data had to be able to
not break our little rules. Yeah,
exactly, and not pretend that you're, or like not forcing the person to see your amazing significance when it's not the case.
No, for sure. You're exactly right that more often it's you might have some big huge difference here, and the stats say that there's very little going on, and just because it doesn't account for all that stuff. But so take raw with a grain of salt.
Cool. Thank you.
But I find for students and like honors students who I present this to, it's like if they can just get that, then we'll call it a win. We'll deal with those other use cases as they crop up. But just so many bar plots you see with the error, and if we can just crack on beyond that, then it's a win for sure. Let me see if I can make a 5-minute bar plot. And then so what am I doing? Oh, okay, and I just made it tricky for us as well, because all right. Right, let's see how quickly I can get this together. Total number of observations of each genus. Okay. It's going to be something like, I need a new variable. Oops. So I need just number of observations by genus. Okay, so it'll be grouping by genus. Well, there's probably a way to do this with count as well. That should do it, shouldn't it? Yeah, okay, there we go. So just the number of counts by genus. All right, I'll plonk this in the chat. No. And because these are pre-counted, I want geom.col. Yes, the genus by count, that should be right. Geom. Cool. Maybe. Let's see if we got that right. So that's just the number of counts by genus. I'll put that in the chat. Oh, nice. Yeah, cool. So that's a polar bar plot. That's pretty fancy. I don't know if that's, I mean, it's pretty wild. I don't know if it's terribly useful for our purposes, but it's pretty cool. When would you use that? It's kind of harder to see them side by side, but I'm sure there'd be instances where you'd want to use a polar plot like that. That's cool. All right, now let's see how quickly I can make this look less ugly. And put in my favorite theme. Be cool. Yes, I mean, that's not too bad as it is. Plus, fix my Y label. Fix my X label, genus. And why don't I I'm going to sort these as well. See if that couldn't possibly have remembered that correctly the first time. Amazing. Okay, so just pulling on some of our tools, column, just renamed my axes, a bit genera, and I just did this little on the fly, I sorted the data, and I'll put that in the chat. So I just reorder them by descending count, which is pretty cool. Well, let's do what's the polar version? Forgotten already. Chord polar. Yeah, I mean, not so useful here, but it's pretty neat. Interesting. I'll put my version in the chat as well. Fill equals, add some color. So that's completely redundant and pretty ugly. But that's how we would do it nonetheless if we wanted to. Gosh, the default palette, they really need to change. Garish. And I'm just going to copy and paste my entire, they're not terribly well commented, but stick it in this Google Doc here. So take this over with a grain of salt because it was just me thinking out loud, but there's my entire little, all my notes that I've just taken today along here. It was too ugly. Cool. Well, I've taken up enough of your time, and it's a lovely day where I am anyway. But I mean, if there are any questions, happy to chat now, or emails, or next week or whatever. But I know we moved to. It's hard to get kind of hard to get a vibe for where everyone is. Sorry, remotely, but hopefully that was of some use.
It was great, Tom. I wish I could say it was a lovely day. I think it might be snowing shortly. It's so yeah, no, that was perfect. It's perfect for me because I'm learning at the same time as keeping up, and it's so absolutely perfect for me. So really useful. So
great. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, we could build on this adventure, going into the future. It's just a nice little foundation, but there's so much you can do with these going forward that yeah, even just this, but yeah, that's great to hear. Hopefully there's some useful bits and pieces.
Thank you. I'll go get my lunch. Take care.
Cool. Bye. Yeah, ciao.